The James Webb Telescope discovered something terrifying in deep space. I work for NASA as an astronomer, and there are certain things we keep hidden from the public. No, the Earth isn't flat, and aliens don't control the government. Fuck, I wish those were the case, as the truth is much, much worse. In 1993, the Hubble Space Telescope saw a star disappear. It didn't go supernova, or die naturally, it simply went dark, over the span of a few minutes. This star was already too faint to see with the naked eye, and ground-based telescopes had trouble picking it out from among the surrounding stars, so the event wasn't widely known to the public. At the time, we thought the most likely explanation was that a cloud of interstellar dust had drifted between Earth and the star, occluding it from view. It was noted and mostly forgotten about. In 2007, 2 more stars vanished. Due to the circumstances of this event, this was much more concerning. The 2 stars in question were part of a binary system, orbiting each other at a fairly close distance. If a cloud of interstellar dust was the culprit again, they would have both seemed to disappear simultaneously, or very close to it. Instead, both stars faded individually over a period of minutes, separated by a span of about 8 hours. This binary system was also about 15 light-years closer to Earth than the star that had previously disappeared in 1993. After carefully reviewing millions of Hubble images, 2 more stars were identified which had gone out, in the years 1995 and 2002. These were all in the same stellar neighborhood, only a handful of light-years from each other. The only conclusion we could draw was that some unknown influence, traveling close to the speed of light, was shrouding, or destroying, these stars. Unfortunately, the Hubble wasn't sensitive enough to tell us any more than that. The James Webb Space Telescope first came online a few months ago. Although official channels will tell you that it's still undergoing testing, we have been actively collecting data since early February. One of the first things we did was to aim the telescope at the regions of space occupied by the vanished stars. If they were being blocked by dust clouds, a hope some of us still held onto, the increased sensitivity of the JWST may have been able to see through them and confirm that the stars were still there. Unfortunately, we had no such luck. The first 3 stars that had disappeared were still completely dark. Gravitational wave detectors, though, soon found something odd. In all cases, not only were the stellar masses still present, but the amount of mass had actually increased. More sensitive observations had also detected a type of string, or web stretching through space connecting these now invisible stars. When we trained the telescope on the binary system that had vanished in 2007, which was the nearest point at which this phenomenon had so far been observed, there was finally enough ambient M-spectrum radiation left to try a mass spectrometer reading. If you're not aware, mass spectrometry is an incredibly useful process, where by measuring the patterns of light wavelengths emitted or reflected by an object, we can learn tons of useful information, such as its temperature, speed and direction of movement, and chemical composition. The readings we got from the binary stars didn't make any sense, though. First of all, they were cold, almost as cold as the surrounding interstellar medium. Whatever had happened to these stars had snuffed them out completely, or somehow prevented their light from escaping. What was truly puzzling, however, were the emission lines returned by the mass spectrometer. Several familiar elements, such as hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and magnesium were identified, but these were few and far between. Most of the readings didn't correspond to any known chemical elements, and even seemed to defy what we knew about the physics of light, matter, and chemistry. This massive, star-spanning structure was primarily composed of materials that we didn't even have names for, and may not even have been matter as we understand it. Speculation ran rampant. Obviously, such a thing couldn't be a natural phenomenon. Finally, we had proof of extraterrestrial life. But what was this thing we had discovered, and for what purpose was it being built? The leading hypothesis was that we were looking at a series of Dyson shells, massive solar collectors built to completely envelop stars, in order to capture 100% of their energy output. Such a concept had been envisioned in the early 20th century, as a potential source of energy for an interstellar civilization. Ever since then, the idea had found its way into popular science fiction. The construction of these massive structures had actually been theorized to be one of the first signs of intelligent extraterrestrial life that we may someday detect. It seemed that day was today.
I was hired to guard a restaurant that is no longer in business. When I saw the job post, I thought it was a joke. The pay was listed at $100 an hour, which seemed like way too much for a security guard position, and to be honest, I thought it was a typo. However, I applied for the job anyway, and the following day I was contacted by a man named Dave, who had written the job post and seemed overly grateful to have someone apply to the position. "Is this Jonas?" Could hear clanging in the background of the call, and it sounded like Dave was somewhere outdoors or something. "Yeah, this is me," I replied. "Awesome. This is Dave. I'm calling you about the security guard position that you applied for. I was wondering if you were still interested in the job and if you'd like to meet me for a quick interview." I was honestly surprised to get a call back that soon, especially since I had been applying to jobs for weeks now and kept getting rejected. "Sure, that sounds good. Where would you like to meet?" "Thank you so much, Jonas. I'll text you the address. It's a coffee shop. I don't have an office right now. Does 3 p.m. work for you?" I glanced at my watch. It was only noon, and I had nothing planned for the day, so I agreed to meet him, and less than 2 minutes after the call, Dave texted me the address to a coffee shop that was a 10-minute drive from my apartment. Once I arrived, I sat down at one of the tables outside the shop. There was nobody else around except for a woman who was sitting near the door, reading a book. A couple of minutes later, a man walked up to the table and waved at me. "Are you Jonas?" he asked. Nodded. "I'm Dave, nice to meet you." Dave was a tall man, much taller than I, with hair that was so blonde and so perfectly slicked back that it would probably hold its shape in a rainstorm. He wore a navy suit that was slightly too small for him. The sleeves ended a few inches above his wrists, and the pants a few inches above his ankles, showing his black socks. He wore a navy shirt with a bright yellow bow tie and carried a briefcase that looked empty. We shook hands and he took a seat across from me. "So, I'm just going to jump right in and explain the job position a little more if that's alright with you." He set the briefcase down on the ground near his feet and clasped his hands together, setting them down on the table. "Sure, that sounds good to me," I agreed. "Very well then, the job requires you to guard a building 5 nights a week from 9 p.m. to midnight. There are some more rules and regulations you'll need to follow that I can fill you in on later if you decide to take the job." Dave spoke fast as if he were in a rush, and I tried to concentrate on what he was saying. "What exactly will I be guarding?" I asked. Dave cleared his throat and looked around a few times. "Have you ever heard of a restaurant called Cheeky's?" he asked. I shook my head. "It shut down about a year and a half. No, 2 years ago. Anyway, one of the locations is still owned by the company. It was the very first Cheeky's that ever opened, and they need some extra security for the building." His explanation seemed vague, and he seemed like he was on edge, or trying to avoid getting into any specifics. "Oh, are people trying to break in or something? Why do they need extra security for a building that isn't being used?" I asked. Dave sighed and let out a short laugh that was forced. "Something like that," he said. Confused, I decided to stop asking about the specifics of the company, trying to ignore the red flags. I needed the job, badly. "I noticed on your job post that the pay was listed at $100 an hour, was that a typo?" I asked, changing the subject. "Oh no, that was not a typo. We want people who will take this job seriously and will go above and beyond to assure that the building is secure," Dave said, his mood flipping in an instant. After hearing that, it was as if the weirdness from earlier had never happened. I was not about to turn down a job that paid me that much, even if my employer was a bit odd. "So, what do you think?" Dave asked after a few minutes of silence. "Do you still want the job?" "Yes," I replied, without giving it a second thought. "Wonderful. Oh, thank you so much, Jonas. I'll send you your schedule and location of the building tomorrow morning." He extended his hand out and shook my hand aggressively. "Thank you for meeting me," I replied as we both stood up. No, thank you for taking this position. You don't know how great this is for me." We parted ways after saying a quick goodbye, and I drove back home, thinking back to Dave and his weirdness at the start of the interview. Tried to think of reasons as to why the pay was so high while the details of the job were so secretive, and after a while, I decided that being a security guard for an old restaurant was a front, and at this point, was more than okay with that. The following morning, I received an email from Dave that contained the address to the building that I was to be guarding, as well as a work schedule for the next week. After I verified my availability, I sent Dave an email back, asking him about the training for the job. He replied about an hour later, only to tell me that somebody named Brandon would fill me in on my first day.